I knew the game was rigged the second I saw his face through the glass, like a cat who'd just buried the canary in my 401k. He motioned me in with two fingers, the kind of arrogant gesture that says I'm about to enjoy this way more than you will. The conference room felt colder than the hallway, and the blinds were half drawn, giving the space that cheap interrogation vibe. On the table sat a manila envelope, its flap already folded like it had been waiting for me all morning. He pushed it toward me without a word at first, letting the tension do the talking. Finally, he leaned back in his overpriced ergonomic chair and said, "We're offering you 20,000. In exchange, you sign this NDA and we all move on. It's a generous offer." He hit generous like it was supposed to leave me speechless, like I'd leap across the table and kiss his loafer in gratitude. Instead, I just stared at him, no anger, no pleading, just letting that smirk burn into my memory. My brain didn't even flinch. It was already 3 steps ahead, calculating odds like a poker player with pocket aces. He thought this was the end of my story. He thought a check and a gag order were enough to scrub me from his little empire. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain that the NDA in his precious envelope couldn't cover what had already left the building months ago, locked, encrypted, and sitting in a safe that didn't have his name on it. Instead, I picked up the pen, signed my name in clean, steady letters, and slid the papers back to him without a single question. That's when he relaxed, and I swear, he smirked wider, like watching a snake finish swallowing something. If you've ever wondered what selling your silence for 20 grand looks like, it's this. You sign, you nod, and you walk out looking beat. But in my case, that paper was nothing but a receipt for the first move in a much longer game. And hey, while I've got you here, a quick thing. Turns out 97% of the folks listening to stories like this aren't subscribed. If you're in that 97%, maybe hit the button. It keeps stories like this rolling, and honestly, it drives the team wild when they see it tick up. Back to the story. He called in HR to make it official, probably so he could watch me escorted out like some office criminal. They stood there, their eyes fixed on the floor, sliding me the usual cardboard box for my personal items. They didn't know that my real valuables, every email, spreadsheet, and transaction log that mattered, were already gone, tucked away where no one in this building could touch them. My mug and a desk plant weren't worth the trouble, so I left them. When I stepped into the hallway, the usual hum of conversation dropped a notch. People suddenly found their monitors fascinating. Coworkers who used to share memes with me couldn't risk making eye contact. In a place like this, proximity to the condemned could get you noticed by the wrong people. So they let me pass like a ghost, and I let them pretend they didn't know me. By the time the elevator doors closed, I'd already pulled out my phone. One quick text to a friend, someone who understood the scope of what was in motion. Just 4 words, it's already in motion. The reply came fast, good. Sit tight. That was the plan. When the doors slid open at the lobby, I stepped into the crisp air and felt lighter, not because I was free of the job, but because the next phase had already begun months ago, before he even knew he'd be in this position. He thought today was the day he cut me off. He didn't realize today was the day his countdown started. Walking toward my car, I passed the reflection of the building's logo in the glass facade. I'd spent 15 years behind those doors, building trust, building systems, watching patterns. And when those patterns started twisting into something I couldn't unsee, suspicious transfers, impossible quarterly reports, numbers that made sense only if you ignored the law, I'd done the only logical thing. I started writing everything down. Dates, amounts, names, screenshots of reports before and after they were revised. Backup files tucked onto an encrypted external drive that never touched company Wi-Fi. I'd sent my first email to the SEC's whistleblower office months before this conference room charade. It was short, clinical, just enough to signal I had more if they were interested. We'd been in touch ever since, quietly, methodically. I never once sent anything from a work device. Never once discussed it with anyone in this building. That's why I could sit across from him today, watch him slide 20 grand across the table, and smile inside knowing that money was a down payment on his own ruin. The engine started smooth when I turned the key, but I didn't drive off right away. I sat there, watching the revolving doors, half hoping to see him step outside so I could wave. He didn't. He was probably still in that glass room, telling himself he'd just handled me. But all he'd really done was sign himself up for a fight he didn't know had already been lost. It started subtle, the kind of thing you could miss if you weren't in the habit of reading numbers the way some people read gossip columns. A line item in a quarterly report that didn't match the raw ledger. Payment to a vendor I'd never heard of, vendor Borealis Consulting, which when I looked it up didn't seem to have a website, a phone number, or even a P.O. box that wasn't a strip mall mailbox store. It was just there like a ghost. At first, I thought it was sloppy bookkeeping. But the thing about patterns is, once you see the first one, your eyes start finding the rest. I kept my face neutral at work, smiling in the break room, nodding in meetings. Meanwhile, after hours, I became my own private forensic team. Every discrepancy got logged. The date I saw it, the original file location, the name of whoever had access to that directory before it disappeared. screenshots of before and after versions of reports, PDFs of transaction histories that mysteriously vanished from the internal system a week later. And everything went straight onto a secure offline drive, one that never touched company hardware, one with 2 levels of encryption. I even bought it in cash out of town, just in case. The deeper I went, the more the picture sharpened. Transfers timed suspiciously close to quarter-end reporting deadlines. Refunds issued to the same handful of shell companies over and over again. Service invoices from firms that supposedly specialized in strategic compliance consulting, which is corporate speak for no one will ever ask what they actually did. It wasn't a bad boss I was dealing with, it was a system, one that had been humming along for years. And the more I pieced together, the more I realized the problem was big enough to have its own gravitational pull. I kept it methodical, no late-night confrontations, no gotcha emails to my manager, just quiet, clean evidence gathering. My emotional state was flat, almost clinical. It wasn't anger anymore, it was purpose. Anger burns out. Purpose runs until the job is done. I knew if I was going to blow this open, it had to be airtight. One night, sitting at my kitchen table with the drive plugged into my laptop, I drafted an email. Not to HR, not to my boss, not to some internal hotline that existed mainly to funnel complaints straight into a shredder. No, this was addressed to the sex office of the whistleblower. I remember pausing before hitting send, thinking about how many bridges I was about to set fire to. The email was short, a summary of what I had, a hint at the scale, and a line making it clear I'd only share the rest through secure channels. The reply came faster than I expected, within 48 hours. It wasn't dramatic, just a polite acknowledgement and a request for a secure drop of my files. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just an employee with a bad manager. I was a key piece of a federal investigation that hadn't even made the rumor mill yet. From then on, my evenings were spent packaging evidence the way you'd wrap something fragile before shipping. Metadata intact. Original file names preserved. Cross-references so tight they could survive any loss of internal data. Every few weeks, I'd send another encrypted batch to my contact, and they'd confirm receipt with a short, almost cold message: received. Continue if safe. At the office, I played my part. Took on projects. Laughed at small talk. Even complimented my boss's tie one morning, while knowing I'd just sent the SEC proof of a $500,000 equipment purchase that never actually happened. I never let on that the rope he was using to climb higher was the same rope I was quietly coiling for the drop. By the time he called me into that glass room months later, my role was already sealed. Whether I stayed another year or walked out that day didn't matter. The machine was already running, and I was feeding it piece by piece. All he could see was a $20,000 gag order. What I saw was a file directory so damning it could outlast any NDA, and a trail of transactions that would eventually lead straight back to him. The HR rep was doing that forced smile thing, the one where their lips curve up but their eyes look like they're begging to be anywhere else. She had the standard cardboard box in her hands, like it had been pulled straight from the prop shelf of every corporate layoff scene in history. She set it down in front of me like a peace offering. I looked inside. A stapler I didn't care about, a couple of pens, and the framed photo of my niece that had been on my desk since she was born. Everything else that actually mattered, the encrypted drive, the backup logs, the paper copies of revised reports, had left the building long before I did. We walked through the office at a pace just slow enough for people to notice but quick enough to discourage conversation. I could feel the shift in the air around us, desks suddenly becoming fortresses of busy work, chairs swiveling away, monitors being stared at a little too intently. Coworkers who used to stop by for coffee breaks didn't dare meet my eyes. They weren't being cruel, they were being careful. In this place, even the hint of sympathy for the wrong person could put you on a list. As we passed my old department, I caught sight of my boss through his glass office door. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at his phone, probably texting someone about how clean the exit had been. He didn't wave, didn't smirk this time, just scrolled with that same self-assuredness of a man who thought the chapter was closed. I kept walking. Elevator ride down was silent except for the low hum of the cables. HR stared at the glowing floor numbers like they might offer a better conversation than I could. I wasn't tense. I wasn't even sad. It was the strangest thing. After 15 years, you'd expect some kind of heaviness. Instead, I felt light, stripped down to the essentials. My part inside this building was over. My part outside it was about to begin in earnest. When the doors slid open into the lobby, the cool air from outside spilled in as if the city itself was ready to take me back. I stepped forward, box in hand, my reflection ghosting across the glass entrance. It didn't look like defeat. It looked like transition. As soon as I hit the sidewalk, I shifted the box to one arm and pulled my phone from my pocket. One message, 4 words, sent to the only person who needed to know what today really meant. It's in motion. The reply came less than a minute later. Stay steady. That was the plan. I walked toward my car parked half a block away, passing familiar lunch spots and coffee shops. The city noises were sharper now, the clink of silverware from a sidewalk cafe, the whoosh of buses, the distant wail of a siren. Everything felt more alive than it had in months. Every step I took away from that building was another step toward a version of this story where I wasn't the one cornered. I unlocked my car and set the box gently on the passenger seat. Inside, the photo of my niece tilted slightly, catching a sliver of sunlight. It made me think about why I'd started collecting the evidence in the first place, not just because it was wrong, but because if the roles were reversed, I'd want someone to do the same for me. Before starting the engine, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The building loomed behind me, all glass and steel, reflecting a sky that didn't care about the deals being cut inside. Somewhere on the upper floors, my boss was probably telling himself he'd neutralized a problem. What he didn't know was that the problem had already left, carrying nothing he could take away and everything he couldn't stop. I shifted into drive and pulled away, the traffic folding around me like nothing unusual had happened. But it had, and the people who thought today was an ending were about to find out it was only the opening move. The first week after I walked out, life felt almost too quiet. No back-to-back meetings, no fake team building calls, no sudden requests to fix numbers that weren't mine to fix. I set up a small freelance routine in my apartment, laptop on the kitchen table, coffee brewing by 7. On the surface, it looked like I'd gone soft, someone easing into a slower, humbler life after getting shown the door. But the reality was anything but humble. Every few weeks, my phone would buzz with a blocked number, and on the other end, my SEC contact would ask the kind of questions that told me the gears were grinding fast behind the curtain. They were already cross-referencing my files against internal audits, piecing together a chain of transactions that didn't just look bad, they screamed intentional. The thing about financial fraud is it doesn't usually leave one big smoking gun. It leaves a breadcrumb trail, one that only becomes obvious when you map it out start to finish. I had given them the map, and they were walking it step by step. My role now was to stay still, stay quiet, and keep living like nothing was happening. That's the thing about timing, you can ruin a perfect trap if you spring it too early. If I made noise, if I hinted to the wrong person that I knew what was coming, the whole operation could fold in on itself. So I played it like any other job I'd ever done, methodically. I filed taxes on time, paid my bills, took freelance gigs that kept my skills sharp. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make anyone think I was sitting on a ticking bomb. The calls from my contact were never long. Sometimes they just wanted a date confirmed, or the original version of a file that had since been altered in the company system. Once, they asked if I'd ever heard the name of a consulting firm tied to several high-dollar invoices. I had, because I'd seen those invoices hit right before quarterly earnings calls, always for strategic compliance advisory services that no one could explain in plain English. I gave them the exact dates those invoices hit and who signed off on them. They didn't react, but the pause on the other end of the line told me they'd just connected another dot. About 3 months in, the first whispers reached me through the old grapevine. A former coworker texted late one night, "Weird stuff happening here. Compliance is working weekends. IT says we're getting mysterious data requests." I played dumb, responding with a simple, "Sounds like they've got a lot on their plate." Inside, though, I could feel the coil tightening. A week later, another contact called from a personal phone. "Hey," they said, lowering their voice even though they were at home. "Do you know anything about missing files? Like entire directories gone?" I told them I hadn't heard a thing, which was true enough. I didn't know about those specific deletions, but I had a pretty good idea why they were happening. When you feel an investigation breathing down your neck, your first instinct is to cover tracks. But the thing about the SEC is, they don't just look at what's there, they look at what used to be there. And sometimes, what's missing is the loudest piece of evidence in the room. By month 4, I could tell from my contact's tone that they were getting close to something big. The questions became more pointed. On March 14th, who besides your boss had edit access to the compliance ledger? Do you have the original draft of the Q3 report before it was sent to the board? Can you verify that this $275,000 wire transfer was approved by both finance and operations? Each answer I gave wasn't just a reply, it was a nail, and they were building the coffin. I kept my emotions level. No premature satisfaction, no daydreams of headlines or payouts. The timing had to be right. And right now, the trap was still open, still baited. I knew enough to know that the closer they got to going public, more dangerous the edges became. Someone in that building was bound to figure out there was an informant, but they didn't know it was me. Not yet. The last time my contact called that month, they ended with something they'd never said before. "We expect resolution very soon. Stay reachable." That was their way of telling me the walls were closing in, just not for me. I hung up, looked out my window at the city lights, and thought about my old boss sitting in his office, maybe still smirking at LinkedIn posts about leadership under pressure. He had no idea that the pressure wasn't coming from competition or market shifts. It was coming from inside the walls, from an investigation that had been under his feet for months. And every time he told himself he had everything under control, The truth was that control had already slipped, quietly, methodically, right into my hands. The rumor came to me the way these things always do, passed along in a half whisper, stripped of details but thick with implication. Legal scrambling, the message said. Something about inquiries, big ones. It didn't say who was asking or what they wanted, but I didn't need the specifics. In a place like that, legal doesn't scramble for parking tickets. They scramble when the questions are coming from people who can take the whole machine apart. I kept my reaction off my face, well, off my texts in this case, just a polite hope you're okay over there. But inside, I could see the first hairline fractures forming in the fortress he thought he'd built around himself. A few days later, I checked LinkedIn out of idle curiosity, or so I told myself. There he was, posting like a man on the campaign trail, proud to lead this resilient team through challenging times. The market rewards integrity and innovation, two things we never compromise on. That last one almost made me laugh out loud. The posts came in bursts, stacked close together, each more inspirational than the last, all accompanied by stock photos of handshakes, skylines, and conference rooms. I'd seen this before, panic camouflage. When someone knows the walls are moving in but still thinks they can outrun them by acting like nothing's wrong. The irony is, the more they try to look untouchable, the more obvious it becomes that they're already touched. About a week later, I got a call from a friend who still worked there, one of the few people I trusted to tell me the truth without embellishment. Compliance is working weekends now, they said. Like every weekend. Lights on in the office, all hands in. They paused. It feels bad. People are nervous. I knew exactly what that meant. Weekend compliance work isn't about staying ahead, it's about plugging leaks in a ship you already know is taking water. Eye contact didn't know the half of it, but their tone told me everything. The mood in that building was changing. I pictured my old boss pacing in his office after hours, tie loosened, going over lists of documents, wondering which ones would cause the least damage if misplaced. He'd be calling in favors from the legal team, asking them to draft explanations that sounded plausible but wouldn't hold up under real scrutiny. I imagined him leaning on people, subtly warning them to get on the same page about events that had already happened. And while he was doing all that, I was doing nothing. Not a thing. No sudden moves, no chest thumping. My role remained invisible, exactly where it needed to be. The best place to hide is in plain sight, but the second best is outside their line of vision entirely. Every so often, I'd get another update through the grapevine. A meeting that ran 3 hours over. Unexplained lockdown on certain financial directories. Mid-level managers being asked to take vacation days during a supposedly busy quarter. It was chaos, but controlled chaos, the kind you get when a handful of executives are still clinging to the belief they can manage the fallout if they just work harder and smile wider. The truth was, the real work wasn't even happening inside their walls anymore. The SEC had the full picture. The cross-referencing was done. It already matched my documentation with the company's own internal records, right down to the discrepancies in timestamps. Every weekend those compliance staffers worked was another weekend they were unknowingly confirming the story I'd already given to federal investigators months earlier. Satisfaction? Yeah, it was there. But it was the quiet kind, the kind you don't post about, the kind you don't even smile about in public. Restraint was the point. If I wanted this to land clean, I couldn't leave fingerprints on the scene before the hammer fell. So I kept my routine, coffee at the same diner on Saturdays. Afternoon walks through the park, small, steady freelance gigs. My name never came up in their speculation. I was a ghost in their story, and ghosts are hard to defend against, especially when you don't even believe they're real until the lights go out. It landed on his lawyer's desk first, probably in one of those thick government-issued envelopes with the kind of return address that makes even seasoned legal veterans sit up a little straighter. At a glance, it could have been anything: a request for clarification, a notice of routine review. Companies get those sometimes, and most of the time they're nothing more than formalities. But this one wasn't. He opened it expecting boilerplate language, maybe a mild inconvenience he could bill a few hours for. Instead, the first page spelled it out in crisp black ink: a whistleblower award notification from the SEC. It didn't just hint at what was happening, it named me. Full name, clear as daylight. The letter explained that I was under consideration for a significant monetary award for my cooperation in an active enforcement action. The figure wasn't final yet, but the preliminary amount being evaluated was substantial. 7 figures substantial. It outlined the scope of my assistance, confirmed the materials I'd provided, and most importantly, tied that assistance directly to the agency's progress in uncovering securities law violations. Somewhere around the third paragraph, his lawyer must have realized that this wasn't a random check-in from a regulator. This was confirmation that the train had already left the station, that the investigation was well beyond the looking into it stage. And the fact that my name was on it. That meant the evidence wasn't just helpful, it was central. I imagine the lawyer reading it twice, maybe 3 times, the same way people reread instructions when they're hoping the words change. Then the sinking moment when they didn't. He would have picked up the phone, called my old boss, and probably opened with something measured like, "We need to talk." But as soon as the words SEC and my name were in the same sentence, whatever calm they'd been clinging to would have cracked. For me, the moment the letter landed was the moment the mask would start to slip. That practiced, confident smirk he'd worn since the day he shoved the NDA across the table, that would be harder to maintain once he knew I wasn't bluffing. Because this wasn't some rumor he could dismiss in a meeting. This was documented, official, and irreversible. And me, I was still silent. My phone stayed face down on the counter, do not disturb switched on. I didn't need to answer their calls, didn't need to confirm or deny a thing. They could stew in the silence, replaying every meeting, every conversation, wondering when exactly I'd started pulling the thread. While they were pacing boardrooms and law offices, I was sipping coffee at my kitchen table, laptop open to a freelance project that had nothing to do with them. Every so often, I'd glance at my muted phone, not to check for messages, but to enjoy the stillness. Because I knew, absolutely knew, that right then, in some expensive office, a man who once thought he could buy my silence for 20 grand was staring at a letter that proved otherwise. This was the part I'd been waiting for. The shift from confidence to calculation, from control to damage control. The instant where he realized the fight wasn't coming, it was already here, and it was already halfway over. And all I had to do was let it keep rolling. They didn't even invite him to the meeting. That's how I knew it was bad. When a CEO, or in his case, the self-anointed king of the building, gets cut out of the room, it's not because they trust him to handle things his way. It's because the rest of the board is trying to figure out exactly how deep they're buried without letting the guy who dug the hole touch the shovel again. From what my source inside told me, the tone in that boardroom was the corporate equivalent of a locked panic room. No small talk, no jokes, no let's circle back. Just a table full of people staring at printouts and legal pads, flipping through pages like they were looking for trapdoor. The first leaks to trickle out made it into my inbox by the next morning. Snippets of allegations, redacted references to material misstatements in SEC filings, mentions of corrective disclosure and exposure management. If you've ever read between the lines of that language, you know it's not about avoiding a problem. It's about surviving the hit. And that was before the second leak, a hushed conversation relayed by someone who'd been in the room. It was just one line, but it was enough. If even half of this is provable, we're talking criminal, not civil. That told me the board wasn't just trying to keep investors calm, they were already bracing for subpoenas. I kept my reaction measured. No calls, no texts, no victory laps. I wasn't interested in a gotcha moment. I wanted the hit to land clean, without anyone being able to trace the weight back to me until it was too late to stop it. Meanwhile, his absence from the meeting must have hit him hard. Men like him thrive on control, on steering the conversation even when they're wrong. Being sidelined would have felt like exile. But worse than the exclusion was the fact that decisions about his future, and possibly his freedom, were now being made without his input. I went about my day as if nothing had changed. Grocery run in the morning, a few hours of freelance work, dinner simmering on the stove by evening. But under that calm, there was an undeniable hum, a low, steady current of anticipation. It wasn't adrenaline, not anymore. Adrenaline spikes and fades. This was colder, more durable. Late that night, my email pinged. It was from my SEC contact, the subject line as sterile as ever. The body of the message was just one sentence: "We expect resolution very soon." I sat back in my chair, reading it twice. Resolution, not progress, not moving forward. Resolution meant they were at the end of the rope. Meant that the threads had been pulled tight enough to hold in court. Meant that, from their perspective, the case was no longer about if but how and when. I closed the laptop and looked out my window. Somewhere downtown, in some half-lit high-rise, there was a man staring at his phone, wondering why his board had gone quiet, why his lawyer suddenly seemed evasive, and why the confident story he'd been telling himself was starting to sound like a lie. He didn't know it yet, but the clean hit was already in motion. All I had to do was stay exactly where I was, outside the blast radius, watching the countdown tick toward zero. It broke just after 9 a.m., tucked into a press release on the SEC's official site. Not a rumor, not a leak, official, permanent, public. The headline was bland, the kind you'd scroll past if you didn't know what you were looking for. SEC announces $1.2 million whistleblower award in major enforcement action. But then you got to the part that mattered. My name, printed in black and white, no aliases, no initials. By 9:15, the financial press had picked it up. By 10 o'clock, national outlets were folding it into the ongoing story about irregularities at a mid-sized but prominent firm. No one needed to spell it out. The timeline matched, the investigation matched, and my name was right there in the middle of it. For the first time, the public version of the story and the one I'd been living for months were perfectly aligned. The effect on him was immediate. His network, the people he used to brag about over drinks, started going silent. Connections that once liked every one of his hollow LinkedIn posts suddenly found other things to do. Invites to conferences dried up. Calls stopped being returned. You don't have to get convicted to become radioactive. Sometimes all it takes is for the world to realize you've been in the blast zone too long. I didn't hear from him directly, but I didn't need to. I knew the kind of calls he'd be getting: investors reevaluating relationships, friends who'd swear they supported him but couldn't be seen with him right now, business partners suddenly unable to commit to future projects. All those handshakes and backslaps from the good years vanish fast when the headlines start using your name next to the word fraud. And me? I didn't spike a glass of champagne or post a cryptic victory quote. That was never the point. The plan had worked because I'd kept it clean, kept it quiet. You don't get moments like this if you waste them bragging before the ink dries. Still, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a deep, private satisfaction in seeing it laid out so plainly for the world. I thought back to that glass-walled conference room, to the smug look on his face as he slid the NDA across the table like he was buying the last word. $20,000 for my silence, as if that could erase what had already been set in motion. Now, in black and white, was proof of the opposite. Not only had I spoken, I'd been heard and rewarded. For it, the very agency he'd been trying to keep at arm's length had put my name in their records as the person who helped make their case. I closed the browser, leaned back in my chair, and let the hum of the city filter in through the open window. Somewhere out there, he was watching his phone stay stubbornly silent, watching doors close that used to open before he even knocked. And he knew, absolutely knew, that the woman he'd tried to buy off for the price of a used car had just signed the receipt for his undoing. The vindication wasn't loud, but it was absolute. The plan had worked exactly as intended. All that was left now was for the final piece to drop. It would have been mid-afternoon, the slow part of the day when the sun starts cutting long shadows across an office and people are just waiting to clock out. His phone rings. The caller ID shows his lawyer's name, which by now is no comfort, it's a warning. He answers with that clipped, impatient tone he uses when he thinks he's about to hear a manageable problem. But the voice on the other end is wrong. No polished calm, no confident spin. Just a tremor, the kind you hear when someone's holding bad news that can't be softened. Sir, you might want to sit down. It's not a suggestion, it's the prelude to impact. He probably reaches for the back of his chair without thinking, lowering himself slowly like the air's gotten heavier. The lawyer doesn't waste time. The SEC probe is no longer inquiries or review. It's a formal investigation now, backed by enforcement. Criminal charges are on the table. Documents have been subpoenaed. Witnesses, plural, are cooperating. His name is already circulating in the wrong offices, the kind where reputations go to die and careers don't get second acts. I imagine the smirk gone, replaced by that hollow stillness that comes when the body realizes the mind's been lying to it for months. All that talk about controlling the narrative, all those private reassurances that he could handle this with the right spin, it's dust now. He's not steering anything anymore. He's the cargo, and the current's pulling him under. The call can't be long. Lawyers don't linger when they're delivering news like this. Every extra second risks a slip, an admission, a detail that could boomerang back in court. So it ends fast, maybe with a flat, "We'll be in touch," before the line goes dead. And then it's just him, alone in that glass office, holding a silent phone. Maybe he looks out over the city, trying to picture which buildings hold the people now digging through his life. Maybe he stares at the NDA he made me sign, still convinced for a heartbeat that it should have meant something. Then the realization settles in. The $20,000 buyout he thought was his masterstroke wasn't just useless, it was the most expensive mistake of his career. He didn't buy my silence, he financed my aim. Meanwhile, my day doesn't shift an inch. The phone on my counter is still on Do Not Disturb. I'm at my desk, finishing a freelance draft, coffee cooling at my elbow. No celebration, no victory lap. Just the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed without a single wasted move. Because I never needed to raise my voice. Never needed to shout, threaten, or posture. The truth was loud enough on its own. All I had to do was let it speak. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.